Thank you all for joining me today. Um, Happy Friday, like I said. I hope everybody has a great weekend ahead. So today we are talking about responding to challenging behavior. I know many of your kiddos may occasionally engage in some more challenging behavior that can be more difficult to understand, difficult to respond to, kind of difficult to navigate. So that is really going to be the focus of our presentation today. And as always, if you have any questions, any comments, anything that you would like to share, please feel free to put your hand up and I will definitely call on you so that we can kind of share all of our thoughts together. Okay, so when we are talking about challenging behavior, there's kind of two different levels that we are talking about. There are disruptive behaviors, which could include calling out of turn, getting out of your seat, kids in school who are, talking nonstop while the teacher's trying to talk. And then there is dangerous, challenging behavior. And these examples might include aggression, property destruction, or elopement. These are behaviors that have the capacity to cause harm either to the child or to others. So responding to challenging behavior. The main thing, excuse me, let me go back. The most important thing always, always, always is to focus on safety. We want to make sure that um, the child is safe, that everyone else in the vicinity is safe. That's obviously our most important priority when challenging behavior does occur. We also want to be sure that we're modeling appropriate behavior and demonstrating respect for the student's dignity while also remaining neutral. So while it may be difficult in the moment to respond to especially like dangerous, challenging behavior very calmly, very neutrally, it is really important to remember that that really is the best way to respond to a child who's already in a very escalated state. We don't need to add to that escalation by becoming escalated ourselves. So when we are talking reinforcement, reinforcement is something we do or we provide when we want to increase a behavior. So we'll talk positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement involves the presentation of something contingent on a behavior that will increase the future likelihood that that behavior will occur. So for example, if you are a teacher and you want your students to raise their hand before answering a question or instead of calling out of turn, right? You would, when your student raises their hand, you are going to, oh my gosh, great job. Thank you for raising your hand. And you're going to call on that student, right? So by providing that reinforcement to the behavior of raising their hand, you have just increased the likelihood that that student is going to raise their hand again in the future when they would like to share with the class. We spoke briefly, I'll kind of go back over. We spoke briefly about our de-escalation strategies and how to use them effectively. Again, we would use de-escalation strategies in the instance of dangerous, challenging behavior. So something that is going to be dangerous to your child or dangerous to others around them. And when our staff members are responding to instances of dangerous behavior, they do appear very calm, they remain neutral, and they implement de-escalation strategies. And then again, at this time, if your child has a behavior intervention plan in place to address these challenging or dangerous behaviors, we would be implementing the steps of that behavior intervention plan at that time. So moving on to functions of behavior. So this is really like when we're talking about functions of behavior, we're talking about the why, right? So why does your child engage in a challenging or dangerous behavior? So the first thing that we need to rule out always is medical causes, right? So um, for example, if your child begins to engage in self-injury, right? He's hitting the side of his head, he may have an ear infection, right? Like he may be in pain, he may have a headache. Like there are some things that we might need to rule out before we jump straight to this is a behavior. For example, I actually had a client um, who a couple weeks ago, he has never engaged in self-injury before, ever. Never seen it. His parents had never seen it. And he had become to get like very agitated when he was redirected and would start to hit his hand against his head. And we couldn't figure out, I mean, it was just we were trying to figure out what the function of this behavior was, like why he was doing this. And it turns out that he was having a lot of digestive issues. So his self-injury would increase when he hadn't been able to use the bathroom, which of course, right? Like he's uncomfortable, his body's uncomfortable, and he wasn't able to communicate that. So he used a more challenging behavior to communicate that he's uncomfortable, to communicate his discomfort. So that's the first thing that we always need to pay attention to, especially if it's a new behavior that you haven't seen before, that your child hasn't engaged in before. We always want to make sure we're ruling out that there might be a medical cause. Um, but then if we have ruled that out, then we're going to move on into considering the four functions of behavior. So the functions of the behavior are the effect that the behavior is having on the environment. So it's basically, again, why is your child engaging in this behavior? The function of the behavior is the reason why the behavior keeps happening. And the four functions of behavior are sensory or automatic. So if the function of a behavior is sensory or automatic, your child may be engaging in that behavior because it's filling some sort of internal need for your child. It could be pain attenuation, like if your child has a headache and hitting himself in the head relieves the pain from the headache. It could be um, just something that feels good. If you have a client who might engage in stereotypy or like vocal stereotypy, where they kind of they have their little noises that they like to make, that would be an example of a behavior whose function is automatic. It just feels good. There's also escape. So that would be escape from non-preferred activities or items or interactions or people or just something that your child does not want to do. There is also attention. So your child might engage in a particular behavior in order to access or maintain your attention from peers, or just attention from others in general. And then the final function of behavior is tangible. So if your child engages in a behavior in order to access a tangible, they are engaging in that behavior in order to gain or maintain access to like a really preferred item or activity, something that they really like. So just diving a little bit deeper into each of our functions, we'll start here with sensory. So the student is using the behavior in order to communicate a need for sensory input, or the behavior feels good to the student without any social mediation. So appropriate requests that would fall under this category might include asking for squeezes, asking for walks, like deep pressure, movement breaks. I have a couple kiddos who will request to hold like a vibrating toy because they like to feel the vibration in their hands or like tap it to their cheeks. Those are all, more appropriate behaviors that would fall under sensory. And inappropriate behaviors that would fall under this category could include hugging someone without asking, self-injurious behavior, head banging, that sort of thing. Again, anything that could potentially cause harm to your child or to others. Okay. When we are talking about escape, so again, your child might be using this behavior to communicate a need for escape or avoidance. So if your child needs escape or needs to avoid something, an appropriate request to meet that function would be asking for help, asking for a break, asking to be finished with whatever task you're doing with them, um, asking for like personal space if they don't want to be near another person anymore. Those are all appropriate ways to meet the function of escape. Inappropriate ways that might meet that function could be like out of seat or elopement, right? If your child will just kind of like run out of the room if they don't want to do something. putting their head down on their desk, refusing to engage with any work or refusing to speak to other, that sort of thing. Those would be more inappropriate ways to meet the function of escape. And then attention. So your child might be using the behavior in order to communicate a need for attention. And it's important, it's very, very, very important to remember with attention maintained behaviors. So with behaviors whose function is attention, negative attention or reprimands can also be reinforcing. So it's important to remember, you may think, well, I'm telling him that I don't like it when he does that. I'm telling him that, that's not nice or he needs to, XYZ about the behavior. You may not realize that attention is attention is attention is attention. It doesn't matter if it's positive and it doesn't matter if it's negative. For some kiddos, if the function of their behavior is attention, it doesn't matter which way it comes. It just matters that they get that attention. So that's just an important thing to remember. So an appropriate way to gain attention, you might teach your child to say, like, please come here, raise their hand, maybe tap a shoulder tap, tap someone on the shoulder, those sort of things. Some inappropriate ways to gain attention might be yelling, throwing things, dropping to the floor, right? Like doing things that we can't ignore. And then finally, tangible. So your child might use a behavior in order to communicate a need for a tangible item or activity. And these are most often going to be like preferred items or activities. So appropriate requests could be asking, right? Just again, functional communication, right? Just teaching your child to ask for what they want. So they might ask for water, for snack, for a game, for the iPad, for whatever it is that they're looking to obtain. And inappropriate ways to meet that function would be taking an item from another student, taking items without asking, aggression, that sort of thing. Anything that's going to help your child get what they want, but in an inappropriate way. So again, here are 4 functions of behavior. You can use the acronym SEAT to remember. So sensory, escape, attention, tangibles. So with sensory, what that does for your child is it provides sensory experiences or the behavior just feels good to do. And it will happen anytime, even when your child is alone, or maybe especially if your child is a little anxious. And with escape, what it does is it removes undesired activities or interactions. And it happens when perhaps the task might be too boring, it might be too hard, it might be too easy, or it might be a little intimidating. Your child might be a little scared to try it. So they might want to escape. And then attention provides access to people or to interactions. And it happens when your child wants social interaction. And then finally, tangibles provides preferred items or activities. And the behavior might happen when your child wants a preferred item or an activity. Now we're moving into talking about ABC data. So ABC data is what helps us determine the function of the behavior. So the A is the antecedent, B is the behavior, and the C is the consequence. And remember that we're talking about the 4 functions of behavior. So sensory, escape, attention, and tangible. And we'll dive into these a little bit deeper. But so when we're talking about antecedents, the antecedent is whatever happens in the environment right before the behavior occurs. The behavior is obviously, it's what you're measuring, it's the behavior itself. And then the consequence is whatever happens in the environment as a result of the behavior occurring. So, and when you hear consequence, don't think, like punishment or something punitive or something negative. The consequence is truly like just what happens as a result of the behavior. So a lot of the times, if your child engages in challenging behavior, the consequence of their behavior might be that they're getting exactly what they wanted, right? If your child requests a lollipop and you say not right now, and then they have a big tantrum in the middle of the grocery store, right? Like you might just hand your child the lollipop to make the tantrum stop. So the consequence of your child tantruming was that he got access to what he wanted. So that's just an example. The example on the slide here, Joey has been working independently on his assignment for 20 minutes. He stands up and hits another student. The teacher brings Joey back to his seat and explains to him what he's done wrong. So in that example, the antecedent would be potentially he's working independently on his assignment for 20 minutes. The behavior was standing up and hitting another student. And then the consequence is that the teacher brings him back to his seat and starts talking to him about why what he did was the wrong thing. Excuse me, the wrong thing to do. So when I'm hearing that example, it sounds to me like Joey might be engaging in hitting in order to access the teacher's attention, right? Because he went 20 minutes working independently, not receiving any attention from the teacher. But the minute he stands up and hits another student, all of a sudden the teacher comes over, sits him down, talks to him. He's getting that one-on-one attention with his teacher. So it sounds to me like that might be what the function of hitting could be. And then our second example, Miranda is watching videos on her iPad. Her TA comes to the break area and tells her it's time to put the iPad away and come to the lunch table. Miranda screams, "No, I'm not done." The TA walks away to give her some space, and Miranda keeps playing on her iPad. Does anybody want to take a crack at this one to talk about the antecedents and the consequence and maybe why Miranda is engaging in screaming? If so, please feel free to raise your hand in the chat. Okay, no worries though. No worries if not. So in this example, it sounds to me like Miranda might be engaging in screaming in order to maintain access to tangible, right? She wants to keep her iPad. She's been playing on the iPad. Life is good. She's not engaging in any behavior until her TA comes over and tells her to put it away. And then that's when we get the screaming, right? So the antecedent is being told to put the iPad away. The behavior is screaming. And then the consequence of the screaming was that the TA walks away to give her space and allows her to continue playing on her iPad. So that TA inadvertently just taught Miranda that if she screams, she can maintain access to her preferred items. And just before we move, oh no, I don't know how to go back. There we go. Sorry, before we move away from ABC data collection, I just kind of want to go back to what Fariel had brought up. It's while you may not necessarily be taking like pen and paper data of your child's behavior, unless your BCBA might ask you to do that, in which case they would walk you through it. But just kind of day to day, while you're not necessarily taking data, like physical data on your child's behavior, it's really important and helpful to look at your child's behavior through this lens, through the lens of ABC data, because it's just going to give you a lot more information and a lot more insight into like, what is your child, what are they saying? What are they communicating to me by engaging in this behavior? Because there's always a reason, right? It's just, it might be difficult to see. So when we're thinking about things in terms of ABC data, it just really helps to make it a lot more clear to us as the adults and as the practitioners or as the parent in that situation. Like what is my child? What do they need? What do they want? What are they communicating to me? So again, it's helpful to kind of keep this lens, in the forefront when your child is engaging in more challenging behavior, because it really will help. It helps to guide how you respond to your child and to the behavior. Okay, so moving on to behavior intervention plans. So again, a behavior intervention plan is basically a list of strategies. It could be a list of steps. It's really just a sort of procedure to respond, like designed to respond to instances of challenging behavior in a way that's not going to reinforce that challenging behavior. So a behavior intervention plan includes operational definitions of the target behaviors for reduction. So that means that each behavior that's included in the behavior intervention plan should be really clearly defined in terms that are observable, concise, clear and very objective so that any two people looking at the behavior they'll know what it is. Like it means the same thing, right? So for example, if I'm operationally defining a tantrum, I might say, um, child engages in two or more of the following behaviors at the same time: dropping to the floor, loud vocalizations, and head banging against the floor, right? Like that gives you a very clear picture of what a tantrum looks like. That would be a good operational definition. The behavior intervention plan is also going to include proactive strategies to prevent the behavior from escalating in the first place. And then it will, of course, include reactive strategies to respond to the escalation in a way that's going to keep everybody safe. Again, that's the most important thing. And that's going to avoid reinforcing that behavior if possible. And then it also includes information about your child's reinforcement system. So just diving in a little bit deeper about operational definitions. An operational definition, again, it gives you a very clear picture of the target behavior. It's tailored to the individual's behavior, and two different people should be able to read that definition and understand what the behavior looks like and how to measure it. So that's another important thing to remember is that, we use like kind of broad categories to like label behaviors. Like we might use aggression or self-injury or property destruction. But what exactly those specific behaviors look like could really vary from child to child. If we're talking about self-injurious behavior, one child might engage in headbanging while another child might engage in skin picking. Like there's a lot of different kinds, right? So we need to have a very clear operational definition of that behavior so that everyone's in agreement of what your child is doing when they're engaging in that behavior. So for example, an operational definition of aggression could be any attempt or instance in which Joey hits with one or two hands, kicks, or bites another person. Each instance of hitting, kicking, or biting will be counted separately. An instance of biting ends when Joey's teeth have stopped contacting the other person's skin for 3 seconds. Example, Joey's brother takes away his crayon and Joey hits him with one hand. A non-example could be Joey finishes one problem on his math homework and gives his sister a high five. Before we move on to proactive strategies, frequency data collection or just data collection in general, operational definitions are very important so that everyone who is collecting the data understands both the behavior that they're collecting data on and when they should actually be taking that data. Like what is an example, what is a non-example. So operational definitions are important kind of in a lot of different realms. But moving forward into proactive strategies. So proactive strategies are used to prevent the problem behavior from happening in the first place. We implement proactive strategies before the problem behavior begins to occur. And we use proactive strategies if antecedents to the problem behavior begin to occur. So if we know, for example, I have a client who we're working on sharing. So he engages in tantrums in order to access tangibles when other clients have the toys that he wants. So a proactive strategy that I've put in place is to do like breathing exercises, calming exercises, and like squeeze a stress ball. And that really seems to help him. So when I see antecedents to his tantrum, so when I see that another client is playing with a toy that he really likes, I'm just going to go right ahead and implement those proactive strategies, those calming strategies, before he even has a chance to engage in tantrum behavior. So that's just an example of proactive strategies. Here's a couple other ones. So functional communication, visual supports, provide choices, environmental manipulation, non-contingent reinforcement, which means that your child can access reinforcement kind of regardless of what's going on. They don't have to do anything to like earn it. It's just available to them. And then as well as social stories. Those are all examples of proactive strategies. So let's talk functional communication training. This is a huge focus of really most of my programming with most of my clients. And it's because FCT teaches clients to use their words to meet their needs instead of using problem behavior. So using your words is referred to as functional communicative responses, or FCRs. So instead of dropping to the floor and engaging in a tantrum, I could teach my client to say, "Can I have a turn?" Right? If they have, if someone else has a toy that they want. I can teach my client to say, or like to choose another activity, right? If my client is engaging in a tantrum because they really want bubbles, I might just teach them to ask for more bubbles, right? So they don't have to tantrum. They can just communicate with me and let me know what they need. FCT is a type of differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So in this type of differential reinforcement, appropriate and safe requests are reinforced, while inappropriate and unsafe requests are not reinforced. So in the example I just gave about um, bubbles, right? I would reinforce my client using functional communication to request bubbles. So I'm going to provide them with bubbles when they just ask me for them, but I'm going to withhold access to the bubbles when they are tantruming in order to access the bubbles, right? So I'm reinforcing the appropriate behavior of making the request and withholding reinforcement for the inappropriate and unsafe behavior of tantruming. And something to remember when with functional communication training is that it should be easier for your child to access reinforcement by engaging in the FCR rather than engaging in the problem behavior. So we don't necessarily want them to have to, jump through a bunch of hoops and have to ask in like a certain particular perfect, pretty way, at least not at first, for something that they want in order to access it. Because if we make the response requirement for the FCR too difficult, your child might find it's just easier to tantrum, right? Or it's just easier to engage in that challenging behavior in order to get what they want. So at first, when we're implementing functional communication training, all appropriate and safe requests are reinforced. So pretty much anything that your child asks for, they can have it. I mean, within reason, of course. Um, But as your child is becoming more competent and more able to make those requests and to provide FCRs for the things that they want, that's when we're going to start reinforcing more intermittently. So sometimes things are going to be available and sometimes they're not. But we want to reinforce pretty much all FCRs at first because we want to teach your child that it's a lot easier to just ask for what you need. You don't have to hit, you don't have to scream, you don't have to cry. You can just ask me and I'll give it to you, right? Um, so that's why we start off by reinforcing really every FCR within reason. And also, as the more appropriate requests, as the FCRs are learned, and the skill is mastered, we might start to then increase the response requirement. So again, with my kiddo who might tantrum to access bubbles, um, when I'm starting functional communication training with him, I'm not going to expect him to say, "May I have some bubbles, please?" before I reinforce by providing bubbles. Like that's too much. That response requirement is too great, and he's probably going to find it easier to just continue tantruming in order to get what he wants. So instead, I'm going to start by just teaching my client to say bubbles. Just tell me bubbles and you can have bubbles. And then as my client is able to make that request by saying bubbles, and the tantrums are starting to decrease because they're learning that they can just use functional communication, then I might start to shape their request to something more complex, like bubbles, please. Can I have bubbles? And then finally, can I have bubbles, please? So it's a slow process. It happens over time. Um, but again, it's just important to remember that whatever FCR you're teaching your child to replace a problem behavior or an inappropriate behavior, it has to be easier for your child to engage in that FCR than it is to engage in the inappropriate behavior. So another example of a proactive strategy, again, this is a strategy that we implement before the inappropriate behavior happens, is visual supports. So this might include visual schedules, FCR supports. So for example, like a functional communication strip, which could be kind of like a choice board, like it gives your child a visual of the different things that they can ask for, that they've learned how to ask for, just as a reminder. So just to remind them, you can just ask for the bubbles, don't have to tantrum. Choice boards, so that would be more of like a big piece of paper with a bunch of pictures on it that your child might be able to point to the things that they want. That may be how they're making requests. That might be how you're teaching the FCR is for them to touch the picture of what they want if they're not able to vocally tell you. A choice board is a great visual support. Token boards, these are often used. I mean, you can really use those in a variety of ways, but they're helpful for kiddos who engage in behavior in order to escape or avoid something. And then first then boards, these are like bread and butter, right? First we have to do the less desirable thing or less preferred thing, and then we can have access to like a highly preferred item or activity. And then a visual support for waiting. That could be like a visual timer, a time timer. It could be like a digital clock, really anything that provides your child with a visual of how long I have been waiting, how long I'm expected to wait, and when I'm going to get access to my reinforcer. So that's just a little example of a token board. So it has a little spot here where your child can place a picture of whatever it is they want to work for, whatever they want to earn after finishing their work, and they earn stars, contingent on work completion. And then once they're finished, they filled up their token board, they can have access to whatever reinforcer they chose to work for. All right, well, it is 11:30 now, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. But I wanted to thank everyone for joining again. Have a happy Friday. If there are any questions or comments, I can hang around for a minute. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a fabulous weekend. Thank you so much.